last week we finished a series called Walking Each Other Home. It was a 6-week conversation about what it means to be on a journey of life, not only as individuals in our spiritual paths, but also together as communities, how we together walk each other home. And I know for me, that frame of a journey gives me a lot of hope. Just recognizing that maybe I am always in process. I can forgive my mistakes. I can see that even if I'm not exactly where I think I should be, that I'm on this walk of life. And that gives me some hope. But I also feel that I need that very same hope when I think about the bigger story of humanity and the bigger story of the universe. I don't know about you, but I need some hope today looking at just the bigger picture and our humanity and what it means to be human. And so I find it to be really helpful to zoom out and to look at our bigger story, not just as a species, but really of all existence in this reality, in the cosmos, and to see that there is some kind of journey and some kind of story that is happening and unfolding over billions of years. And perhaps we can recognize that we are in the middle of that story, right? That we are not necessarily at the beginning or the end, but we're right in the middle of something that we cannot fully understand. But if we recognize that we are part of a bigger process and a larger unfolding, then maybe as we zoom out, we can start to see the outline of some bigger, more beautiful, more expansive story than what we so often get caught up in our narrow perspectives. And that is the story of the good, the true, and the beautiful. That is this series, and that is something that we're going to unpack over the next 3 weeks. Now, you probably, most likely, have heard of all three of these things on their own, right? Have we all heard of goodness? Everyone? There's so few of you have raised your hands, so I feel like our education system, or maybe our religions have failed or something, but hopefully you've all heard of truth, and we've probably all heard of beauty, yes, right? Now, what we're going to do in this series is we're going to look at these words and what happens when you put them together, because like a BLT, follow me, okay, like a BLT, there are these things exist on their own, right? Like bacon, great. Tomato, I'm a fan. Lettuce, also great. But together, they create something magnificent. For you vegetarians out there or vegans, PB&J, right? Peanut butter, bread, jelly, and then together something that transcends the sum of their parts. And so there's this reality that happens when you put the good, the true, and the beautiful together, that they actually start to represent different faces of a certain reality about life and an unfolding in the universe and the bigger story that we are all a part of. The first person to name this as such, to talk about these three words together, was the philosopher Plato, okay? And it's important that I really emphasize the T, Plato, because I was this week I was working on this message. I was leaving little notes for myself on my phone, and I kept saying Plato this, Plato that, and I looked and I realized that it had marked it all as Play-Doh. So I'm not talking about the children's toy, which I so love, but Plato's great, but I'm not talking about Plato. I'm talking about Plato, the Greek philosopher who really the foundation of so much philosophy and a lot of the spirituality that we know today comes from Plato. And Plato was the first person to really name the good, the true, and the beautiful as different faces of some larger reality. And so I want to use a quote of his to kind of illustrate how he spoke about the three together. He said, "The good is the cause of all that is right and beautiful and the source of truth and reason." They are all connected deeply. They all play off one another, and perhaps they are all different variations of the same thing in different forms. And so throughout this series, we're going to explore this. We're going to see how goodness is really the foundation of truth and beauty. But we're going to see how when we live lives of truth and authenticity, we can more participate in the work of goodness and beauty in the world. And that perhaps beauty is evidence that there is truth and evidence that there is goodness and love in our world. And all three of these ultimately are pointing to something that we might consider spirit. that when the divine, or what we might think of as the infinite, interacts with our finite world, it shows up as goodness and as beauty and as truth. And so this conversation has been going on for thousands of years, and then there is a more recent frame and a recent way that this reality has been talked about, especially with the advent of more modern understandings of science. And so the frame that we're going to kind of explore throughout this series is called evolutionary spirituality. And what this frame has done is it takes science and it merges it with spirituality to see a larger unfolding that has been happening in the universe. And what I love about it is it's grounded in physical reality, and yet it is ultimately a spiritual understanding. And so I want to just remind you first, it's a frame, right? All frames are limited. Frames are not the be-all, end-all. If this frame does not resonate with you, don't worry, it's only 3 weeks, and there's going to be other stuff. So if you're like, hey, not totally my thing, don't worry about it. But I just want to present it to you as one perspective, one way of looking at this story. All spirituality, in some ways, is storytelling about this beautiful mystery that we are part of, right? And so just want to invite you to hold it loosely, but to understand that this can be a powerful way of looking at this thing that we're all a part of, right? And so I want to say a few things about evolutionary spirituality before we really get into our topic for today. And basically, I want to just lay 3 foundational understandings that I think will be helpful for us as we have this conversation. And the first is this. When we're talking about evolutionary spirituality, I don't want you to get bogged down with that word evolution, that we're not only talking about Darwin. That is one perspective of evolution. I think it's a beautiful frame for how we've, evolved into what we are today. But this is just one sliver of this bigger story that we're talking about. That actually the universe has been in a process of becoming, another word for that, evolving, right? It's been in the process of becoming since the beginning. So cosmically, the universe has been evolving, right? It's been complexifying, becoming more than what it once was. And certainly, yes, life evolves. Biologically, we become more, we evolve. But also think about consciousness. Think about where we are today, that our consciousness, our capacity to think, to reflect, to engage in a spiritual reality has evolved throughout time, right? That we are in a very different place in terms of consciousness than we were 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, and certainly millions and millions of years ago. But then this also applies to society, right? Our society evolves and shifts and changes. So does our technology. So there's all these different threads and ways in which the universe itself is actually in process. It's in this journey of becoming. Now, if you doubt any of this, right, I just want to really hone in on this story for a second, because I think there is such beauty and elegance and something really profound about this story, and I just want to invite us to look at it for just a second. So we're going to go all the way back to the beginning, okay? This is the beginning. Not much going on, right? Is this the earliest picture ever recorded, or is this just a black screen? That's for you to decide, okay? But eventually, over time, things start to emerge, and we get planets, and we get galaxies, right? And the dust of stars, and through gravity is pulled together, and all of a sudden, things start to emerge in the cosmos. And then eventually these planets start to have all kinds of, at least some of them have all kinds of activity. Now this is a picture of Earth. At least, I'd like to think it's a picture. I don't know. I was told that this is a photograph from Earth. In the really early days, Earth was kind of a mess. And I know that often when we look at old photographs of ourselves that we go like, man, I was a mess when I was younger. But Earth, I think, takes the cake. Earth was really a mess. And from what I understand too, like the Airbnb situation was really terrible back then. You could not get insurance on anything. So it was really But this is kind of the foundations and the prerequisites for what eventually would become life on our planet, right? Because through all this, eventually we have land and we have oceans, and at the bottom of these oceans, all of a sudden, some things started to emerge. Initially, just single-celled organisms, nothing super complex. But you can look at this and you can say, "Hi, great, 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 great grandma and grandpa. Hello, good to see you." I skipped some greats in there, right? But if you just, we all kind of originate from stuff like this. And then ultimately this develops into, again, something not as pretty as we are today, but, something like trilobites, right? And you might say, okay, at the bottom of the ocean, still life is contained down there, but hello, great, 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 great grandma and grandpa. And then over time, things get more beautiful and elegant, and then, you have dinosaurs giving way to some of our more close relatives, right? These are the exactly. And ultimately, then some of our more recent ancestors in the animal kingdom, some of our most closest ancestors in the animal kingdom, eventually start to evolve and give way to some of what we would call our earliest human ancestors, or Neanderthal. Or this might be a picture of a couple from Portland. I'm not totally sure. But eventually Neanderthal gives way to Homo sapien, and Homo sapien ultimately begins this journey of consciousness in which we start to reflect on our surroundings. We start to create. We start to make things of beauty, things we want to be remembered by, even a sense of spirituality and a questioning of what we are doing here. And this art, which starts as painting on cave walls, ultimately over, say, thousands of years, ends up becoming more beautiful, more complex, more capacity to reflect on our place in the universe, and just maybe technically a little better. And then, that gives way to music and gathering and creating beautiful experiences of art, like such as this symphony, right? That we've gone from molten lava to symphonies, and it doesn't matter how long it takes. I think it's a pretty incredible journey. And then along the way as well, we have the emergence of some different ideas and thoughts about what it means to be human, right? The way of Jesus or Buddha, different concepts about what are we actually doing here and how might we live in the world in a way that is good and true and beautiful. And eventually we get technology, right? We develop things that really are platforms for the possibilities of the future that are endless. And this leads us, friends, to what I find to be the pinnacle of human potential and progress, something that I think really defines our place on this planet, and that is the segue. So there's a story here, right? Now, jokes aside, there is a story here. It's a story in which everything transcends and includes, right? We evolve, we change, we evolve, we grow, and yet we work with the building blocks of the past to become something even more. Our human bodies are actually a great example of this, that within our bodies we contain remnants of all of our ancestors going back to single-celled organisms. We have transcended what we once were, and yet we have included along the way all these different versions of what we've been. And this is the story of the universe. The universe has been emerging and transcending for billions of years. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about evolution, okay? That's sub point one of point one, okay? We're just talking about evolution for a second. This is that grander story. Now, here's the second point, and the thing that I want to just illustrate about evolutionary spirituality. This story that we just talked about, that from this frame of evolutionary spirituality, that story actually within itself holds a spiritual teaching. That if you look at this and you see the progression and you see the direction, it points to something that we might name as divine or God, some force of love in the universe, some directionality that holds purpose, right? I don't care how you name it, but there is this sense that when we look back at all of this, that there is a spiritual reality emerging. Okay, so that is something that I think is important to hold with us as we move throughout this series. And the last thing I want us to just hone in on with evolutionary spirituality is the reality that this story, this spiritual reality, what it actually is, more specifically, is all along the way, all along these different aspects of our growth, there is a greater awareness and a greater expression of those big three: the good, the true, and the beautiful, right? So as all of creation has evolved, but then as human beings, as we evolve, we become more aware of what is good. As we evolve and we change and we shift and we grow, we become aware of what truth is. We become more aware of beauty in the world. How many of us could say that in our journey of life, we have become more aware of what is good and what is true and what is beautiful? And then the other thing that happens is that we are able to express it. That in our journeys, we're able to express goodness in a different way. We're able to express truth, and we are able to express beauty. And ultimately, these are leading us to what we might call a spiritual reality. There's a guy named Steve McIntosh. He wrote this great book, The Presence of the Infinite. I've drawn from some of his ideas for this series. So if you're really into what we're talking about in this series, you could read this book and take it a little further. But he says this: everyone who has felt the power of truth, the kindness of goodness, or the loveliness of beauty has had an experience of spirit. I find this to be a relief, right? Because in our lives, it can sometimes hold some uncertainty, right? You can be unsure. Have I had a spiritual experience lately? Like what in my life is spiritual? You might wonder, what does it mean to have a relationship with the divine? What does it mean to try to have a spiritual life? And I love this understanding that wherever there is truth in our lives, wherever there is goodness in our lives, wherever there is beauty in our lives, we are experiencing spirit. Right? So wherever you're out there and you're trying to make the world gooder or truthier or beautifuler, you are engaged in a spiritual work. You are matching up with the direction and the journey of the universe. Yet how many of us look out at the world today, or you look back at really all of humanity and you go, sometimes it seems like being human is the opposite of these things. You look out at the world, or you look out at humanity and how we've kind of showed up for thousands and thousands of years, and you could say, wow, you talk about goodness, and yet I see a lot of evil in the world. Or you talk about truth, and yet there are a lot of lies. There's a lot of deception, right? That maybe we live in one of those times where more than ever before, we have to wonder what even is true, right? So all these things are getting called into question. You say, yeah, you could talk about beauty, Jake. You could talk about the splendor of art and creativity, and yet we live in a world where there have not been one, not two, but 6 Sharknado movies, right? Is it a beautiful world? If you don't know what Sharknado is, it's exactly what it sounds like. So, look, I know that it can be really hard to see the good and the true and the beautiful, but the premise of this series, and really the perspective of faith that I'm inviting you to, is to recognize that the good and the true and the beautiful is emerging in our midst and has been emerging throughout the journey of the universe. And no, it's not always linear. No, it's not always easy. Yes, there have been plenty of hiccups along the way. But I think that even for us to sit here today and recognize that things are not as they could be or are not as they should be, that itself is evidence that there is an emerging recognition in our hearts of what the good and the true and the beautiful is. And so with whatever time I have left today, I want to just take some time and focus on what is the good. We're going to talk about the good today, the true next week, and the beautiful the following week. And so I just want to take a little bit of time and talk about what is the good. It is a complex conversation to talk about what is good, because what is good shifts in time and in space, right? That as time progresses, if we look throughout history, how we've defined goodness has evolved, has it not? And yet it also can change spatially, meaning In different parts of the world, different definitions of what is good might look a little different. This is a concept known as moral relativism. It's this sense that what might be good for one culture might not necessarily be good for another. I'll give you some examples, okay? There are cultures, and I would say the American culture is one of them. There are cultures where if you were to burp in a restaurant at the end of a good meal, that would be considered rude. Burp loudly, right? That would probably be considered rude. I promise you this. Oh, someone gave an example. There are cultures where, I'm not joking, there are cultures where burping loudly after a delicious meal is the highest compliment you can give to the chef. No joke. There are cultures in which eating insects is considered a delicacy, and there are others, like probably your culture, in which swatting them is what you tend to do with insects, right? There are cultures, and I found this out actually just this week. There are parts of Southeast Asia where they believe that the head is the seat of the soul, and that if you touch someone's head without their permission, you are actually interfering with their soul, and it's considered like a really big no-no, right? And for our culture, I'm not inviting you to just touch my head without permission, but it's not as big of a deal. There are even cultures, friends, that consider universal health care to be a human right. I know, it's crazy. Wild, I know. But the point I'm making is that there is a relativity and a subjectivity that we need to have and hold if we're going to have a conversation around goodness. That there is some nuance that we need if we're going to talk about things that are not just static, but always evolving and shifting. And hasn't this been true for all of us? Right? Think about your life and think about how your awareness of what is good has changed throughout your life. Your ability to extend compassion to others has evolved in your life. I think about my own journey. I grew up in really mainstream evangelical Christianity. And in that world, at least when I was, definitely, for sure, something that's very, very important and held as really central in that world is this idea that to be gay is not a part of God's plan. And so I was taught that the kindest, most compassionate thing I could do would be to tell someone that if they're gay, that they're deviating from God's ideal plan, right? So that was how I was told to define goodness from a young age. And then through life experience, through personal spiritual shifts, I came to the opposite place and the opposite conclusion, that I could look at love of different sexuality, different gender identities, and see goodness and truth and beauty in the midst of those relationships, right? That there was nothing that they needed to do to deserve affirmation or inclusion. And certainly in a spiritual context, that the highest thing we could do in a place like Aldea is to affirm and celebrate those relationships. But that is a reality that shifted, right? I started in one place, right? I was taught some things, and life invited me into a different understanding. Another version of that is growing up, I was told that any other religion held a truth that was lesser and secondary to the religion that I was a part of. And then through life and time and experience, I began to see the goodness and the truth and the beauty in these various traditions, these various ways of exploring spirituality and religion. And again, I ended up in a very different place where I could celebrate all of these different approaches and see them as part of this larger arc and story. So what my understanding of goodness in these areas changed. And I know that the same has been true for you, right? The same has been true for all of us. We all have ways in which our understanding of what is good evolves. And what's interesting about it is it's something that happens internally, and it then turns into this shift in how we behave and how we live. Ken Wilber is one of the preeminent philosophers in this kind of study of evolutionary spirituality, and he says, the good is that which increases depth and span, greater interior awareness joined with greater compassion. So we have an interior shift that increases the depth and the capacity to be aware of what is good, and then it results in an exterior shift that goes from inside to outside, and then we are able to live from a place of greater compassion, right? So the shifts I just told you about for me, they started internally, just a different way of thinking, and ultimately led to a different way of being in the world, from thought to action. But here's what I think is really crucial for us to understand, friends. However the good is showing up for you, it may look different. Whatever the invitation toward greater awareness and greater compassion might be for you in this moment, it might look different than for another person. It probably will, because we are all unique. Our journeys are unique. So that increase in awareness for you might look a little different than that increase in awareness for me. It might look different for you than it does for some of your family, some of your friends. And this can be a hard thing, that sometimes we look at other people in our lives and we wish that they had different ideas or different thoughts. But perhaps the shift today is to celebrate any movement towards good, even if it looks different than where we're at. That wherever there is movement, wherever there is going in the direction of goodness and truth and beauty, it is worth celebrating. Because as Sri Aurobindo said, the good is not a fixed standard, but a movement towards greater truth, light, and harmony. It is about the directionality. It is about the movement. I'll give you an example. I want us to think about history for a second and think about how religion has developed throughout history. We think about something like the 10 Commandments today as pretty archaic, right? We would say those don't really hold the nuance that we need for life in our world today. But there was a time in which the 10 Commandments was a massive step forward in human consciousness. That in the time of the 10 Commandments, which was so archaic and so brutal, this idea that a divine source would be inviting people to live to this moral code in which there wasn't things like murder and theft, it was a huge step for the time, right? And so though we might look back now and be like, I don't relate to that, but can we also recognize the movement in its time? And things were indeed moving, because not just a few thousand years later, along comes Jesus, who invites the same group of people into a deeper understanding of love, a deeper understanding of forgiveness, even when it's difficult and challenging. He went far beyond thou shalt not kill into this really expansive sense of how to love. Or we look at Buddhism. Think about the metta meditation in Buddhism, which says, can you expand your awareness to include love for all sentient beings, right? And so what we see even throughout our spiritual and religious traditions is a movement towards greater truth, light, and harmony. Can we be honest with ourselves that our own relationship to what is good can be nuanced and can be complex and is not always crystal clear? But I know for me, when I'm trying to pursue goodness, sometimes it feels like a step forward, a couple steps to the side, maybe a diagonal step back, right? And it can be a challenge. And this is why I think having a motto like love period is so crucial, because we need love and understanding and compassion as a baseline, that it's going to be messy, that if we're going to be in community, we're not always going to be fully in step with each other, but we have a baseline of grace and understanding. That ultimately, this whole series is about love. And there are 3 invitations that we're going to look at throughout this series. That the good, the true, and the beautiful are all inviting us to see love with a bit of a different face or perspective. Beauty says, you are loved. Right? Think about when you look at a beautiful sunset, you see something in nature, you see a beautiful child or a piece of art that moves you to tears. And in some way, behind whatever's on the surface, there is this recognition that there is love, that I am loved, that there is enough love in the universe. Truth invites us to grow and expand, to challenge what we once thought things were into a bigger, more expansive view of how love is showing up in the world. So beauty says you are loved, truth says grow, and goodness says love others. Goodness ultimately results in compassion. So love is at the core of this conversation around goodness, truth, and beauty. They all reveal love. Teilhard de Chardin was one of the kind of founders of this thought of evolutionary spirituality, one of the most well-known, and he said love is the most universal, the most tremendous, and the most mysterious of the cosmic forces. Friends, whenever we choose love, wouldn't it make sense that it expands us even beyond what is comfortable? Because the universe is expanding. Wouldn't it make sense that it's not going to be easy at times? But if we can follow in the footsteps of love, if we can follow in the direction of love, really we are participating in the direction of the universe itself. Maybe you're looking out at the world today and you say, Jake, I don't see the love. I don't see the goodness. I feel like you're talking about direction. Maybe we're going backwards. But friends, in this story that has been going on for billions and billions of years, the universe always finds a way to bring about goodness, truth, and beauty. And maybe if you're looking at a world today wondering where it is, maybe the invitation is that the universe is trying to bring about goodness, truth, and beauty through you, right? That you are the vehicle through which the universe evolves in love and evolves in goodness. And so if you're willing to participate in that great work today, then I just want to ask you a couple questions. How do you define what is good? How is goodness showing up in your life right now? How can you be more compassionate? Where is compassionate inviting you into new things, new spaces? How has your understanding of goodness shifted throughout your life? How is it shifting right now? And where is this invitation towards goodness even a little bit uncomfortable? I want to close with some of Jesus' most well-known words, the words from his most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, and a particular section of that sermon called the Beatitudes. And you know, Jesus is, I think, an interesting figure in our world today, because when we think about how Jesus defined goodness, that is over more debate than I've ever seen in my lifetime right now, how Jesus defined goodness. And there are at least two very different interpretations of how Jesus viewed what is good. And so I want to just take a look at these to close, because I think this teaching in many ways sums up how he was showing up in the world, what he was inviting his followers to, and through that, really inviting all of us to. And I think in these verses, you'll see that there is a calling to greater love, to greater goodness. And maybe you would say, okay, that's good. That was good for that time. But remember that we celebrate movement wherever we see it. And so even if you don't fully relate to these words, can we celebrate what they would have meant at the time and maybe how they might be speaking to you today? This comes from the Gospel of Luke. But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. You probably know that classic. If you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Can we look at goodness in such a way through Jesus' eyes that says, can we be more than simply good to those who are good to us? Can we expand our definition of goodness, maybe so far beyond what is natural to our human instinct that it might feel very uncomfortable at first? But perhaps this is the arc of the universe. So friends, here's my invitation to us today. May we continue to expand our definition of what is good. I actually think that Jesus would want for us to expand our definition of goodness past what he was even able to articulate in his life and in his context. Because that is ultimately the movement of love, to continue to expand and expand and expand. That is the story of the universe, and that is the emergence of the good, the true, and the beautiful.